inflation adjustments to your E.R.S. and FERS pensions. Let's break it down on this episode of the Hawaii Retirement Show. All right, welcome everyone. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Hawaii Retirement Show. Today's episode, I wanted to touch on the inflation adjustment to your state of Hawaii employee retirement system pension, as well as for our federal workers, your FERS pension. And when I say inflation adjustment, some people might say COLA, cost of living allowance. I think what is the state? The state E.R.S. uses a different term. They say, what do they call it right here? Post-retirement allowance is what the E.R.S. calls it. Post-retirement allowance. But essentially what it is, inflation, most of our listeners probably know, you guys are all pretty smart, savvy. You lose purchasing power years over years, right? A soda used to be 50 cents, now it's $1, right? And that's due to inflation, right? And so with your pension, this monthly, annuity that you're getting for your years of service in the state or the federal system, they factor that in, and they like to kind of give you throw you a bone, so to speak, so that way you can not lose purchasing power throughout your retirement years as you collect the pension. And what I want to do in this episode is kind of dive into what that inflation adjustment looks like specifically for the state of Hawaii E.R.S. pension and the FERS. But to kick things off, I think it's worth noting, I wanted to look up what is the U.S. average inflation annually. And I found from tradingeconomics.com from 1914 to 2024, the average inflation in the U.S. is 3.3%. Okay? So some of those years were probably, I think, I forget what the highest is, but it's close to like 20%, I think. And then some years it's zero. I think there was actually negative inflation in some of those years, but that's probably a black swan, a rare type of thing. But 3.3% is the 1914 to 2024 U.S. average. Now, when we're talking about inflation, what does that mean? And where do we get this inflation number? And typically, the most commonly used measure for this is the Consumer Price Index, CPI. Okay, so I pulled up a little definition of CPI. I'm sure a lot of you have heard it. I've never read a definition myself, but this is the definition from U.S. Bureau of Labor and Statistics. And it says, the Consumer Price Index is a measure of the average change over time in the prices paid by urban consumers for a market basket of consumer goods and services. Indexes are available for the U.S. and various geographic areas. Average price data for select utility, automotive, fuel, and food items are also available. Okay, that's from the U.S. Bureau of Labor and Statistics. So what I take away from there is prices paid by urban consumers for a market basket of consumer goods and services. Okay, so that's CPI, clear as mud, right? But CPI is really easily accessible. You can check in on it on a monthly basis, and then you can look at it as an annual type of thing as well. So moving along to the state of Hawaii and the employees' retirement system, I'm talking hybrid plan here because that is seems to be the most overwhelming majority of participants in the E.R.S. system here in the state of Hawaii right now. And I went in to look at the publications there for the different retirement systems, and when I went down to its Q&A number 16 on that publication is where it talks about this post-retirement allowance. And what it states is that depending on your membership date, right, because that's when the hybrid plan had the hybrid 1 or hybrid 2, and they kind of switched over. If you're on the earlier side, before July 1st, 2012, then your post-retirement allowance, or what I call inflation adjustment, is 2.5%. Okay, if you came in after that June 30th, 2012, then it decreased to 1.5%, and that is automatic and it's consistent. It's not based off of the consumer price index. It's just a steady state, either 1.5 or 2.5%, depending on which hybrid plan you're in. And like it says, this allowance is designed to help offset the rising cost of living, and has no ceiling. So it just keeps going, right? It doesn't just cap out if you just keep earning more and more. But when we get into the federal retirement system, this is where it's semi based off the consumer price index, and the federal retirement system uses the verbiage of COLA, cost of living allowance. And for the FERS increase, it's kind of a tiered system. So if the consumer price index is 2% or less, so 2% or less, then the COLA adjustment will be equal to the CPI increase. So if it's 1.75, then the COLA adjustment will be 1.75. Okay. So then moving along, if it's more than 2%, but no more than 3%, okay, so there's a little window, 2% to 3%, then the COLA is 2%. Okay, so it caps it off there. So if it's 2.75, you get 2%. Okay, if the consumer price index increase is more than 3%, the adjustment is 1% less than the consumer price index increase. So if inflation was 7%, right, and it's more than 3%, then FERS is going to give you a 1% less adjustment to your pension there. So if it's 7%, they're going to give you a 6% increase. If it's 10%, they're going to give you a 9%. If it's 5.5%, they're going to give you 4.5% increase. And that's how the federal retirement system figures out their inflation adjustment, which they call COLA. And so just circling back to CPI to kind of put that all in perspective, looking at the last few years, we got 2020, the CPI was 1.2%. 2021, it was 4.7%. 2022, it was 8%. And 2023, it was 4.1%. 2024 is looking like an estimate of 3.2%. So again, the state E.R.S. system is that flat number, automatic, either the 1.5 or 2.5%. It doesn't factor in really the consumer price index. Whereas the FERS is going to, depending on the window, right? If it's over that 3% in the consumer price index, then they're just going to subtract 1% from it, and that'll be your COLA adjustment. Now, it's not a huge deal, especially early on in retirement. But if you extend this out, 30 years, and let's say next year, inflation is 5%. For our FERS people, you're only going to get the 4%, right? And for our HRS, you only get the 1.5 or 2%. So you start to lose purchasing power, right? And not very much. Now, there might be some years where inflation is 1%. And if that's the case, you kind of make out our state workers, because you're going to get the 2.5 or 1.5%. So you exceed that, right? But typically, if you lose out on a year, and let's say inflation is high, and your COLA, or for the state workers, your inflation adjustment is under that, it's hard to catch back up, right? To recover as you kind of extend out your years in retirement. That's why it's always good to supplement with, they use the terminology, a three-legged stool, right? Which is, you have Social Security, which also has a inflation adjustment on it. You have a pension, and then you have a retirement account, right? State workers, 457, 403Bs, and then federal workers, you have your TSP, right? And so your three-legged stool helps kind of keep you ahead of the game, right? You're not just relying on this pension. Some people do, but what'll happen is you start extending this thing out 30 years, and you might find yourself, with not as much purchasing power late in retirement as far as your pension goes. Okay, so that about wraps it up here for the inflation adjustment to your E.R.S or FERS pension. If there's anything else you want me to talk about on the show in particular, email it over to aloha@hawaiiretirementshow.com, and we'll catch everyone on the next one.
The opinions and statements presented on this show are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations. Never make any investment or financial decisions based on information offered on this show without first consulting your financial, legal, or tax advisor. All economic and performance information mentioned on the show is historical in nature and is not indicative of any future results. All indices mentioned on this show are unmanaged and cannot be invested in directly. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy. Lastly, all opinions expressed by Jason Cutitta and any guests on the show are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinions of or are endorsed by ToBA Financial. For Jason Cutitta, investment advisory services are offered through ToBA Financial LLC, a registered investment advisor offering advisory services in the state of Hawaii and in other jurisdictions where exempt from registration.